Out on the unforgiving plains of the Wyoming Territory, where the sky is a vast and lonely canvas, a single decision can mean the difference between life and death. For Emily Vance, a woman living in the shadow of loss, that decision came in the form of a dying man, an enemy by birth whose people were known for their brutal justice. She offered him water, a simple act of mercy. But mercy in this land is a currency paid for in blood and fire. By nightfall, her isolated cabin was no longer a sanctuary, but the heart of a siege. This is the story of how a single cup of water could either drown a woman in violence or build a bridge between two worlds on the brink of war. The heat of the late August sun was a physical weight on Emily Vance's shoulders. It pressed down on the vast, golden expanse of the prairie, shimmering in waves that made the distant black hills tremble like a nervous heart. Her world had shrunk to this small patch of earth, a sturdy log cabin built by her late husband, Julian, a well that was her lifeline, and a small fenced garden where stubborn vegetables fought the dry soil. It had been 2 years since the fever took Julian, leaving Emily in a silence so profound it had its own sound, a low hum of wind and memory. She was returning from the creek, her wooden buckets heavy and sloshing cool dark water onto her dusty boots. It was a half-mile walk, one she made twice a day, every day. The well water was fine for washing, but the creek water, filtered by stone and shaded by the few cottonwoods that dared to grow there, tasted of life itself. That's when she saw it. A smudge of darkness against the ochre dirt, not a rock or a shadow. Her hand instinctively went to the small revolver, holstered at her hip, a constant companion Julian had insisted she master. As she drew closer, the smudge took form. It was a man sprawled face down his back, a canvas of dried blood and dust. He was Native American, that much was clear from the buckskin leggings, and the single eagle feather tied into his long black hair. His tribe, she guessed, was Lakota. Their lands bordered this territory, a constant unspoken tension in the air. Settlers spoke of them in hushed, fearful tones, trading stories of raids and scalpings, most of them exaggerated, some of them horrifyingly true. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs. The sensible thing to do, the thing every other settler for 100 miles would do, was to turn around. Walk away. Forget she saw anything. This was not her fight, not her business. Involving herself was an invitation for disaster. But then the man groaned, a low guttural sound of pure agony. She couldn't. Julian had been a good man, a kind man. He believed mercy was not a gift to be given only to friends. It's when it's hardest to give, he used to say, his hands tracing the grain of the wood he was carving, that it means the most. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Emily knelt beside the warrior. His skin was hot and feverish, his lips cracked and pale. A dark, ugly wound marred his side, a bullet hole by the look of it. It was festering the source of the blood on his back. He was dying of infection, and more immediately of thirst. His eyes fluttered open. They weren't filled with the hate she'd been taught to expect. They were dark, clouded with pain, but lucid. He saw the water buckets, his gaze fixed on them with an intensity that transcended language. It was the look of a man staring at salvation. She looked at the vast, empty prairie around them. No one was watching. No one would know. It was a choice made in the silence between her and her conscience. Slowly she unhooked the dipper from the side of the bucket. She scooped up the cool creek water, the sound of it seeming to echo in the stillness. Holding the warrior's head with one hand, she brought the dipper to his lips. He drank at first with a desperate, choking greed, then more slowly, his body seeming to absorb the moisture like parched earth. He drank 3 dippers full before his head fell back, his eyes closing in exhaustion. He was too heavy to move to the cabin, and the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and violet. She couldn't leave him here for the coyotes. Making another decision that defied all logic and instinct for self-preservation, Emily half dragged, half carried him, his dead weight, a terrible burden, the 100 yards to a small shaded overhang of rock not far from her path. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. She cleaned his wound as best she could, with water and a strip of linen from her apron, her movements gentle and practiced. She had nursed Julian through his final days. Her hands knew the rituals of care. She packed the wound with a poultice of yarrow she always carried for cuts and scrapes, a trick her grandmother had taught her. As she worked, she studied his face. He was young, younger than her own 26 years. His features were strong with high cheekbones and a proud, firm jaw, even in his current state of weakness. There was no cruelty in his face, only strength. When she was done, she left one of the water buckets and the dipper beside him. "Drink," she whispered, knowing he likely didn't understand. "Stay here, I'll come back." As she walked the final stretch to her cabin, the weight of what she had done settled upon her. She had given aid to the enemy. She had interfered with a fate that was not her own. The gratitude in his eyes warred with the fear in her gut. She latched the heavy bolt on her cabin door, the familiar sound doing little to soothe her. The silence inside was different now. It was a waiting silence, heavy with consequence. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the world outside Emily's window turned a deep, bruised purple. The first stars began to prick the velvet darkness. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every rustle of the wind in the tall grass sounded like a footstep. She couldn't eat. The bread and salted pork on her table sat untouched. Her mind was a maelstrom. She pictured the warrior, alone under the rock ledge. Would the yarrow work? Would the water be enough? Or would she return in the morning to find a lifeless body, her efforts a futile gesture against the brutality of this land? A different, colder fear slithered into her thoughts. What if his people found him? They would track him, surely. What would they do if they found her scent on him, the evidence of her linen on his wound? Would they see it as an act of mercy or a defilement? Unable to bear the stillness, she lit a second lantern, its warm glow pushing back the creeping shadows in the single-room cabin. Her gaze fell upon Julian's rifle, resting on its pegs above the fireplace. He had taught her to shoot, to clean it, to respect its power. She had only ever fired it at rabbits and a single, bold coyote. The thought of aiming it at a person made her stomach churn. A low moan from outside snapped her to attention. It wasn't the wind. It was human. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed the rifle, her hands trembling as she checked the load. Peeking through a crack in the shutters, she saw nothing but the moon-drenched prairie. The sound came again, closer this time. A pained, shuffling the sound of someone dragging themselves through the dirt. He had followed her. The warrior had used the last of his strength to crawl to her cabin, to the source of the water, to the only human soul he had seen. He collapsed against her door with a heavy, final-sounding thud. Emily's mind screamed at her. "Keep the door bolted. He will die out there, and you will be safe." It was the voice of survival, cold and logical. But another voice, Julian's voice, whispered in her heart. Is that a life worth living, Ellie safe but empty? With a sob of frustration and fear, she threw the bolt. The heavy door swung inward. The Lakota warrior tumbled partway into the room, his eyes barely open his face, a mask of fevered agony. The wound in his side had bled anew. "You fool!" She whispered the words lost between a curse and a prayer. "You stubborn fool!" Dragging him inside was a monumental effort. He was lean, but tall and dense with muscle. Her back screamed in protest as she heaved him onto the bare skin rug in front of the cold fireplace. She bolted the door again, her sense of isolation now absolute. She was trapped in here with him. In the steady lamplight, she could see how dire his condition truly was. His skin was slick with sweat, his breathing ragged and shallow. The yarrow poultice was soaked with blood and pus. The infection was deep. Without proper care, he would be dead by morning. For the next few hours, Emily worked with a frantic, focused energy. She stoked the fire not for warmth, but to boil water. She stripped away his torn buckskin shirt, her touch clinical, trying to ignore the intimacy of the act, the sculpted muscles of his chest and arms. She washed the wound again this time, with hot water and soap earning a pained hiss from his clenched teeth. She rummaged through her precious medicine chest, a small wooden box of remedies passed down from her mother. She found willow bark for the fever, crushing it into a bitter tea that she carefully trickled between his lips. She found her sharpest sewing needle and a bottle of whiskey. Steeling her nerves, she sterilized the needle in a flame, and after taking a deep breath and offering a silent apology, began the gruesome work of cleaning the infection and stitching the torn flesh. He was delirious, muttering in a language she didn't understand, his body tensing with each prick of the needle. At one point, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, burning with fever, locked onto hers. For a terrifying second, she saw a flicker of the warrior within a flash of violence, but then it softened into confusion, and finally a kind of pleading. He wasn't fighting her. He was holding on. She spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur as she worked the way she would to a spooked horse. "It's all right. I'm just helping. You're safe here. Just hold still now." Finally it was done. The wound was clean and stitched, bound with fresh linen. The fever hadn't broken, but he was resting his breathing a little easier. Emily slumped against the wall, her body aching, her hands stained with his blood. The room was silent, save for his breathing and the crackle of the fire. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was no longer a stranger on the prairie. He was a patient, a life she had taken into her hands. Her cabin was no longer just her home. It was a sanctuary, a hospital. As exhaustion began to claim her, a new sound reached her ears, faint at first, then growing steadily. It was a low, rhythmic beat, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, the sound of hoofbeats. Not one horse, not two, dozens. Emily scrambled to the window, her heart seizing in her chest. She peered through the shutter. In the pale, ethereal light of the full moon, she saw them. A ring of riders sitting motionless on their ponies, their forms stark and menacing silhouettes against the silvered landscape. They held spears and rifles, the moonlight glinting off the metal. They were a silent, watching army. At dusk, his tribe had come. They had surrounded her cabin. Fear was a cold, sharp thing in Emily's throat. She backed away from the window, the rifle feeling impossibly heavy and useless in her hands. There were at least 30 of them. Maybe more. A silent, stoic circle of judgment. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. It was somehow more terrifying than a full-throated charge. Her gaze darted to the man on her floor. He was the reason they were here. He was her death sentence. They would think she had captured him, hurt him. They would burn her cabin to the ground, with her inside. The warrior on the rug stirred, his brow furrowed in pain. His name. She didn't even know his name. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence outside was absolute, a heavy blanket of unspoken threat. They made no move, uttered no sound. They just watched, Emily felt like a fly trapped in a jar, every movement observed by unblinking eyes. Her initial panic began to curdle into a strange, defiant resolve. She had done nothing wrong. She had saved this man's life. If she was to die for an act of compassion, then so be it. But she would not die cowering. One of the riders dismounted. He was taller than the others, with a presence that radiated authority. Even from this distance, she could see the lines of age and worry etched on his face, the regal set of his shoulders. The chief. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He stopped about 50 feet from her door, a silent invitation. Emily knew this was the moment of reckoning. Hiding would be seen as guilt. Taking a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she laid the rifle on the table. She unbolted the door and stepped outside, closing it gently behind her. She kept her hands open, and visible at her sides, a universal sign of peace. She prayed they would understand. The cool night air was a shock against her skin. The collective gaze of the warriors was a physical force, pressing in on her. The chief's eyes were dark and piercing, missing nothing. He looked at her. Then his gaze flickered to the closed door of her cabin. He spoke, his voice low and guttural, a question in a language she could not comprehend. But his meaning was clear. "My son. Where is he?" Emily swallowed hard. "He is inside," she said, her own voice sounding thin and reedy. "He is hurt. I am helping him." She pointed to the door, then to her own heart, then made a gentle rocking motion with her arms, the universal gesture for care, for cradling. The chief's expression didn't change. He remained a stone-faced statue of suspicion. One of the younger warriors shouted something from his horse, his tone sharp and angry. He gestured at her with his rifle. The chief raised a hand, silencing him without a glance. He took another step forward and spoke again, his tone demanding. He pointed at the door, then at himself. He wanted to see. This was the precipice. If she let him in, his warriors might storm the cabin. If she refused, they would assume the worst and do it anyway. Trust. She had to trust. Emily nodded slowly. She backed toward the door, never taking her eyes off the chief. She opened it, but stood in the doorway, blocking the view. She held up one finger, then pointed at the chief. "1. You alone." A murmur went through the riders. The idea of their leader entering a settler's cabin alone was clearly unsettling. The chief, however, seemed to understand. He saw the logic in her fear, perhaps even a flicker of respect for her courage. He gave a sharp, commanding order to his men. They remained mounted, but their weapons were lowered slightly. A tense acknowledgement. He walked to the door, his footsteps silent on the hard-packed earth. He was a mountain of a man, his presence filling the doorway. He smelled of leather smoke and the wild prairie. He looked past her into the warm, lamp-lit interior of the cabin. His eyes found the form of the young warrior lying by the fire. A flicker of emotion, deep and profound, crossed his face. It wasn't anger. It was anguish. He stepped inside his gaze, locked on the still figure. He knelt, his movements fluid and graceful for such a large man. He gently touched the young man's forehead, then his chest, as if reassuring himself he was alive. His fingers traced the edge of the clean bandage on his son's side. He looked at the discarded blood-soaked rags, the bowl of reddened water, the needle and thread on the small table. He looked up at Emily, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the bloodstains on her dress. He saw the truth. He spoke a single word, his voice raspy with emotion. Kyle. So that was his name. Kyle. The chief bore in, as she would later learn his name, was rose to his full height. He looked around the small, tidy cabin at the bookshelf, filled with Julian's books, the neat stack of firewood, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. It was a home, not a fort. He turned back to her. He placed his right hand over his heart and gave a slight, formal bow of his head. It was not a gesture of surrender, but of acknowledgement. A truce. He then spoke in a quiet, firm tone, pointing to Cale, then outside. He wanted to move him. Emily shook her head fiercely. "No," she said, her voice finding its strength. She pointed at Kyle's stitched side, then mimed the jolting of being carried. "The wound will open. He has a fever. He needs to stay here. To rest." Borin's brow furrowed. He did not understand her words, but he understood her meaning. He was a father, desperate to get his son back to the safety of his people, to the care of their own medicine man. He saw a white woman, an enemy, telling him no. The fragile truce wavered. Suddenly, Kyle moaned, his eyes fluttering open. His fevered gaze found his father kneeling beside him. He whispered a few weak words in his own tongue. Whatever he said, it changed everything. Borin's entire demeanor softened. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a profound, weary gratitude. He looked at Emily, then back to his son. He spoke to Kyle, his voice gentle. Kyle responded, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes drifting shut again. Chief Borin stood. He looked Emily in the eye, and for the first time she did not see a fearsome enemy. She saw a father. He spoke a sentence to her, the tone soft. Though she did not know the words, the message was clear. "Thank you." He walked to the door and spoke to his men. The tension outside dissipated like smoke. Several warriors dismounted. They did not approach the cabin. Instead, they began to set up a camp. They built small fires, tended to their horses, and settled in for a long watch. The siege was over. But now Emily Vance was the willing keeper of the chief's son, her home, a neutral territory in a war she wanted no part of, surrounded by the very people she had been taught to fear her entire life. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was anything but free. The days that followed fell into a strange, surreal rhythm. The Lakota camp was a constant living presence just beyond her fence line. They were a community of ghosts. She could hear the soft murmur of their voices, the nicker of their ponies, the crackle of their fires. But they kept their distance. They were watching, waiting, honoring their chief's command. Inside the cabin, life revolved around Kyle. The fever held him in its grip for 2 days, a dangerous, wavering battle between life and death. During his delirium, he spoke. He called out names Borin, his father. Tashina, a name spoken with a soft, aching tenderness, and another name spat with venom, Blackwood. The name was English. Blackwood. Emily recognized it. Silas Blackwood was a rancher who had claimed a large parcel of land about 10 miles to the north. He was a hard man, with a harder reputation, known for his aggressive expansion and his open disdain for the natives whose land he was encroaching upon. He had tried to buy Emily's plot last year, telling her it was no place for a woman alone. He hadn't been offering help. It had been a veiled threat. He wanted her water. The creek and her well were the most reliable sources in the area. She had refused. He had not been pleased. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Emily woke from a short, fitful sleep in her rocking chair to find Kyle watching her. His eyes were clear, the fever gone. The pain was still there, but it was a clean pain, not the toxic haze of infection. "Water." He rasped, his voice rough. She brought him the dipper, and he drank deeply. He pushed himself up on one elbow, hissing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Thank you," he said. The words were heavily accented but clear. Emily was startled. "You speak English a little?" he said, his gaze taking in the cabin lingering on her face. "Learn from a trader. Enough." He looked down at the neat stitches in his side. "You did this?" She nodded. "I had to. The wound was poisoned." He lay back, his expression thoughtful. "My father, he is outside." "Yes." "With many warriors. They have been waiting." A faint smile touched his lips. "He is not a patient man." The smile faded. "He believes a settler shot me." "Did they?" Emily asked softly. Kyle's eyes hardened. "One man. Not a soldier. A rancher? He calls himself Blackwood." The name landed like a stone in the quiet room. "Silas Blackwood?" she asked, her voice tight. Kyle's eyes narrowed in surprise. "You know him. He is my neighbor, if 10 miles can be called neighborly. He wants my land. He wants the water from my creek." The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place in Emily's mind, forming a terrifying picture. Kyle explained in his careful, deliberate English. He had not been part of a raiding party. He had been hunting, tracking a buck that had led him south near her creek. Blackwood and 2 of his hired hands had been there inspecting the water flow. They hadn't challenged him or warned him off. They had seen him, and Blackwood had simply raised his rifle and fired. It was an ambush, an act of casual murderous greed. "He wants this land," Kyle said, his hand gesturing weakly to the cabin around them. "He thinks if he kills one of us, my people will retaliate. They will attack the settlers. Maybe you. The soldiers will come drive us out, and he will take what he wants in the chaos." Emily felt sick. Blackwood wasn't just a greedy rancher. He was trying to start a war with her cabin and her life sitting squarely on the fault line. She was not an innocent bystander who had stumbled into a conflict. She was living on the prize. "Your father must be told," she said urgently. "He has to know it was Blackwood, not just any settler." "He will not listen to words," Kyle said, a weary frustration in his voice. "He will see only a white woman defending a white man." "My father's heart has been hardened by too many broken treaties and too many graves." He was right. Borin's gratitude was a fragile thing, extended only to her, only for the act of saving his son. It would not extend to the world of settlers she represented. To him, Silas Blackwood was just another face of the same enemy. An attack on Blackwood would bring the cavalry and a world of pain down on his people. He was trapped. And so was she. The Lakota outside were no longer just a protective watch. They were a potential powder keg. If Blackwood discovered Kyle had survived and was here in her cabin, he would not hesitate to finish the job. He would see her as a collaborator, an Indian lover. He would come for her and for Kyle. The cabin, once her sanctuary from the world, had become the calm center of a gathering storm. She was caught between a suspicious tribe who saw her as an outsider and a ruthless rancher who saw her as an obstacle. Her act of mercy had not resolved a conflict. It had placed her directly at its heart. The true danger was not the warriors outside her door, but the man who wanted what lay beneath her feet. And he had no idea his victim was still alive, breathing the air in her home, his story a secret that could get them all killed. A week bled into the next. The world outside the cabin remained suspended in a delicate, watchful peace. Kyle grew stronger each day. The stitches held the wound began to heal, and the color returned to his face. His presence filled the small space, no longer as just a patient, but as a person. They began to talk. In the long, quiet hours with the Lakota camp, a silent backdrop, they traded pieces of their lives. He spoke of his people, of the endless sky, and the great buffalo herds that were now dwindling. He described the sun dance and the sacred Pahasapa, the Black Hills, the heart of his world. He spoke of Tashina, the girl he was to marry with a quiet reverence. Emily in turn told him of Julian. She spoke of their dream to build a life here, of his laughter that used to fill the cabin, of the devastating silence he left behind. She found herself talking about things she hadn't spoken of to anyone, the words unlocking chambers of grief she had kept sealed for 2 years. Kyle listened, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, profound understanding. He knew of loss. It was a language they both spoke fluently. A tentative friendship began to grow fragile as a prairie flower. He would watch her as she worked, kneading bread or tending her garden under the watchful eyes of his kinsman. She learned the Lakota word for water, and he learned the name of the herb she used on his wound yarrow. She discovered a wry sense of humor beneath his stoic exterior, and he saw a resilience in her that was as unyielding as the land itself. But their fragile peace was contained within the cabin walls. Outside, the situation was precarious. Her supplies were dwindling. She was running low on flour, salt, and coffee. More pressingly, she needed more linen for bandages and salves from the small trading post at Willow Creek, a full day's ride away. She couldn't leave. The warriors would not allow it. To them, she was still the keeper of their chief's son. Her departure would be seen as an abandonment, or worse, a trick. She had to speak with Boren. With Cale acting as a hesitant translator, she requested a meeting. The chief entered her cabin for the second time. He stood stiffly, his arms crossed, his gaze hard. The gratitude he had shown had been buried again under a layer of ingrained distrust. "I need to go to the trading post," Emily stated, simply looking Boren in the eye. Kyle translated. Boren's response was a sharp, guttural negative. "Tell him my medicines are running low," she insisted. "If the wound becomes poisoned again, I will have nothing to treat it with. I need clean cloth and herbs I do not have." This was a slight exaggeration, but a necessary one. Kyle relayed the message. Boren's eyes flickered to his son's healing side. He was caught between his suspicion of her and his concern for Kyle. He spoke at length to Cale, his tone questioning, probing. "He asks why he should trust you to return." Cale said, his face impassive. "He says the white man's towns are full of lies and soldiers. He thinks you will go and bring them back." The accusation stung. "This cabin is my home," Emily said, her voice shaking with a quiet fury. "Everything I have is here. My husband is buried on that hill. Where would I go? I saved your son's life. That is my only truth. If that is not enough, then nothing will be." She met Boren's gaze, her own unwavering, letting him see the honesty and hurt in her eyes. Kyle translated her words, his voice carrying the weight of her conviction. Boren was silent for a long time, studying her face. He was a leader of men, a shrewd judge of character. He had seen deceit and treachery in the eyes of generals and government agents. He did not see it in hers. He saw the same fierce, protective spirit that he valued in his own people. Finally, he gave a curt nod. He spoke to Kyle. "He will allow it," Kyle said, a hint of relief in his voice. "But you will not go alone. 2 of his warriors, Sun Eagle and Stone Hand, will go with you. Not to guard you," he added quickly, seeing her expression. "To protect you. The road is not safe." It was a test and a concession. An escort from the tribe would be a shocking sight at the Willow Creek post. It would mark her, brand her as something other. But it was also a profound gesture of trust, an acknowledgement that her well-being was now tied to theirs. "I accept," Emily said. The journey 2 days later was a tense, silent affair. Sun Eagle and Stone Hand were formidable figures, their faces unreadable, their movements economical and precise. They rode on either side of her wagon, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. At the trading post, their presence caused an immediate stir. Settlers and traders stared their hands, inching toward their weapons. Old Man Hemlock, the proprietor, his face pale, served her quickly, his questions unspoken, but hanging heavy in the air. As they rode back, a rider approached from the north. It was one of Silas Blackwood's men, a man named Jeb. He reined in his horse, his eyes wide with disbelief at the sight of Emily flanked by 2 Lakota warriors. "Mrs. Vance," he stammered, "you all right? These savages ain't forcing you?" "I am fine, Jeb," Emily said, her voice cold and steady. "They are my escort." Jeb's eyes narrowed, a malicious understanding dawning on his face. "An escort, huh? Blackwood ain't gonna like this. He ain't gonna like this one bit." He spat on the ground, turned his horse, and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of dust. The message had been delivered. Sun Eagle looked at her, then at the retreating rider, and spoke a single word in his tongue. Stone Hand grunted in agreement. When they returned to the cabin, Kyle was waiting by the door, leaning against the frame. He looked from Emily to his kinsman. What happened, Emily told him about the encounter with Jeb. Kyle's face grew grim. "Blackwood knows," he said. "He will not wait for us to act. He will come now. He will try to silence the witnesses." He looked at Emily. "You and me." The fragile peace had been shattered. The uneasy alliance forged in the quiet confines of the cabin was about to be tested by fire. The news that Blackwood's man had seen Emily with a Lakota escort spread through the territory like a prairie fire. To the scattered settlers it confirmed their worst fears. The lonely widow in the Vance cabin had thrown her lot in with the savages. She was a traitor. To Silas Blackwood, it was an intolerable complication. He sat in the study of his sprawling ranch house, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. Jeb stood before him, shifting nervously, flanked by 2 of 'em boss, bold as brass. Like she belonged with 'em, Jeb repeated. Blackwood slammed the glass down on his oak desk. The whiskey sloshed over the rim. "That woman," he snarled. "I offered her a fair price. I warned her. Now she's sheltering the very vermin I'm trying to clear out." He had assumed the warrior he'd shot was dead, his body dragged off by his kin. It had been a perfect plan. Shoot one brave, let the tribe retaliate against some poor, unsuspecting sodbuster, and then let the army clean up the mess. The resulting fear and instability would make acquiring land cheap and easy. But now the warrior must have survived. He must be the reason the Lakota were camped on Emily Vance's doorstep. He was a living witness to Blackwood's crime, and the woman was protecting him. They're making her a pariah, his foreman, a grizzled man named Marcus, pointed out. No one at the post will trade with her now. She'll be starved out. "I don't have time to wait for that," Blackwood snapped. "That brave can identify me. If some do-gooding marshal or army captain gets wind of this, it could ruin everything." He paced the room, his mind working the gears, grinding with a ruthless logic. "We have to clean this up. All of it." "You mean the whole camp?" Jeb asked, his eyes wide. "I mean the source of the problem," Blackwood clarified his voice, dropping to a low, chilling tone. "The cabin. We hit the cabin. We create chaos. In the confusion, we make sure the brave and the woman who's protecting him are silenced. Permanently. It'll look like they were caught in the crossfire of a tragic misunderstanding. A regrettable consequence of the Indian problem. He was framing it as a preemptive defensive strike. A group of concerned citizens protecting themselves from the savage threat harbored by a traitorous woman. He would be a hero. "Gather the men," Blackwood commanded Marcus. "Tell them the Vance woman is supplying the Lakota for a raid. Tell them her cabin is their staging ground. Fear will make them believe it. We ride at dawn. We'll use the rising sun to our backs." Meanwhile, at Emily's cabin, a different kind of preparation was underway. Sun Eagle's report to Chief Boren had confirmed their fears. Kyle, now able to walk with a slight limp, stood with his father and Emily near the creek, the three of them forming an unlikely council of war. "He will not come with a large force," Kyle translated for his father. "It would look too much like a massacre, bring the army's eyes. He will come with his own men, maybe a dozen, and try to make it look like a defense of his land. He will aim for the cabin," Emily said, her voice steady. She knew Blackwood. He was a coward at heart, a man who preferred ambush to an open fight. "He will try to burn us out, thinking your main camp is too far to respond in time." Boren listened intently, his gaze sweeping over the landscape around the cabin. He saw the small rise to the west, the rocky outcropping to the south, the creek bed that provided a natural trench. This was his world. The art of reading the land was in his blood. He spoke to Cale, his words sharp and decisive, pointing to different locations. "My father will not let him reach the cabin," Cale explained. "He will split his warriors. A small group will remain visible here as a decoy. The rest will hide. Sun Eagle will take men into the creek bed. Stone Hand will take others behind the rocks. They will let Blackwood's men ride into a trap. It was a classic Lakota strategy: lure the enemy into a space of your choosing and attack from all sides." Boren then looked at Emily, a question in his eyes. Kyle translated. "My father asks what you will do." "This is my home," she said, her chin held high. "I will not run from it. I have a rifle. I know how to use it." A flicker of respect crossed Boren's face. He nodded. He then gave her a command, relayed by Kyle. "He wants you to stay inside. Bar the door and the windows. When the fighting starts, stay low. Your home will be the center of the trap. They will try to get to you and me. You must not let them." That night, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy electric tension. The normal quiet sounds of the camp were gone. The warriors moved like shadows, melting into the landscape, their forms disappearing into the pre-dawn gloom. Inside the cabin, Emily checked the load on Julian's rifle. Her hands were steady. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective anger. Blackwood was not just threatening her life. He was threatening to destroy the fragile peace she had found, the unexpected connection she had forged. Cale sat by the fire, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic shk, 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 the only sound in the room. He was still not at full strength, but the light of the warrior was back in his eyes. "You are not afraid?" he asked quietly, not looking up from his work. "I'm terrified," Emily admitted honestly. "But I'm more angry. Julian and I built this place with our own hands. We poured our hopes into this soil. I won't let a man like Blackwood turn it into a grave." He stopped sharpening the knife and looked at her, his gaze intense. "Tashina, the woman I am to marry. She has a spirit like yours, a fighter's heart." It was the highest compliment he could give. He stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. "They will come with the sun," he said. Emily stood beside him, and together they watched the eastern horizon, waiting for the first pale light of a day that would bring either salvation or ruin. The sanctuary had become a fortress, the patient had become a fellow soldier, and the woman who had only wanted peace was preparing for war. The first light of dawn was a pale grey promise on the horizon. It was a cold, deceptive light, offering the illusion of peace while hiding the violence that was to come. Inside the cabin, Emily and Kyle stood in silence, the air thick with anticipation. Outside, the world was unnervingly still. The decoy camp had been arranged to look normal, with a few small fires burning, But the Lakota warriors were invisible, secreted into the earth like spirits of vengeance. Then they heard it. The distant, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, growing steadily louder. "They are here," Kyle whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. Emily moved to her position at the front window, peering through a small crack in the heavy shutter. She saw them cresting the small ridge to the east, a dozen riders with Silas Blackwood at their head, the rising sun at their backs, silhouetting them like wraiths. They rode with a grim purpose, their rifles held ready. They paused at the ridge, surveying the scene. They saw the cabin, the small decoy camp, the tethered horses. It was exactly what they expected, a sleepy, unprepared encampment. A smirk touched Blackwood's lips. This was going to be easy. He raised his hand and gave the signal to charge. The riders spurred their horses, letting out whoops and yells, a wave of brutal intent, sweeping down the gentle slope toward the cabin. Their plan was simple: ride through the small camp, scattering it, then surround the cabin and burn it to the ground. They were halfway down the slope when the world exploded. The first volley of arrows hissed out of the creek bed to their left. They were silent, deadly projectiles. Two of Blackwood's men cried out and tumbled from their saddles before they even knew they were under attack. Horses screamed and reared in panic. Before they could recover, a barrage of rifle fire erupted from the rocky outcropping to their right. The sharp crack of the rifles echoed across the prairie. Another 2 men went down. Blackwood's charge dissolved into chaos. His men, caught in a perfectly executed crossfire, scrambled for cover that didn't exist. "It's a trap," Blackwood bellowed, his face a mask of fury and shock. He wrenched his horse around, firing blindly toward the rocks. "Fall back! Get to the cabin! Use it for cover!" It was a fatal mistake. By turning toward the cabin, he led his remaining men deeper into the kill zone. From inside, Emily watched her heart pounding. She saw a few of the men break away, charging directly for her home as ordered. They saw it as their only salvation. Julian's rifle was heavy in her hands. She rested the barrel in the firing slot she'd prepared, took a deep breath, and lined up her sights on the lead rider. He was a big man, his face contorted in a snarl. She remembered Julian's voice. "Squeeze Ellie, don't pull." She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, the explosion deafening in the small room. The rider jerked in his saddle as if struck by an invisible fist, and fell heavily to the ground. Emily felt a wave of nausea, but pushed it down. There was no time for remorse. Kyle let out a fierce cry of approval from his position at the side window. He loosed an arrow, felling another of the attackers, who was trying to light a torch to throw onto her roof. The battle was short and brutal. Caught from 3 sides, Blackwood's force was decimated. Borin's warriors rose from their hiding places, a tide of fury sweeping over the remaining men. It was a swift, terrible, and efficient destruction. Soon only one of the attackers remained on his horse, Silas Blackwood. He stared in horror at the carnage, his plan in ruins, his men dead or dying. He saw Chief Borin astride his war pony, blocking his path of retreat. And then he saw Cale, standing in the doorway of the cabin, an arrow nocked in his bow, his aim steady. The man he had tried to murder was alive, and his father's army was at his back. In a final desperate act of malice, Blackwood raised his pistol. He didn't aim for Borin or Cale. He aimed for Emily, who was now visible in the doorway behind Kyle. "If I'm going to hell, I'm taking the witch with me," he screamed. He fired. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Kyle, without a moment's hesitation, threw himself sideways, shoving Emily back into the cabin. The bullet that was meant for her slammed into his shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out in pain and collapsed onto the floor. At the exact same moment, 2 things happened. The arrow from Kyle's bow, released as he fell, flew true and buried itself in Blackwood's chest. Simultaneously, a rifle shot from Chief Boren's position echoed across the field, striking Blackwood in the head. The rancher was thrown from his saddle dead before he hit the ground. Silence descended upon the prairie, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the nervous stamping of horses. The battle was over. Emily scrambled to Kyle's side, her hands frantically searching for the new wound. It was a clean shot through the fleshy part of his shoulder, painful and bloody, but not fatal. He had saved her life. Chief Boren and his warriors swarmed the cabin. Boren burst through the door, his eyes filled with a father's terror. He saw Kale on the floor, clutching his shoulder with Emily already pressing a clean cloth to the wound. He saw that his son was alive, and the fear in his eyes was replaced by a look of fierce, profound gratitude directed at the woman who had now twice been instrumental in saving his son's life. Emily looked up from her work, meeting the chief's gaze over his wounded son. The smoke of gunpowder hung in the air, the metallic scent of blood was everywhere, and the bodies of a dozen men littered the ground outside her home. The storm had broken, and they were the survivors bound together by the blood that had been spilled on this small patch of earth. The chasm between their two worlds, once impossibly wide, was now bridged by shared survival and mutual sacrifice. The aftermath of the battle was a somber affair. The Lakota dealt with their own wounded and mourned their few losses with a quiet dignity. Under Boren's orders, they buried Blackwood and his men in unmarked graves, erasing their violent intrusion from the land. In the days that followed, the tribe prepared to leave. Kale's new wound was healing, and it was time for them to return to their own lands in the Black Hills. An unspoken question hung in the air, heavy and poignant. What now? The bond forged between Emily and Kale, between Emily and the tribe, was undeniable, but their worlds remained fundamentally separate. A Lakota warrior could not live in a settler's cabin, and a white woman could not disappear into the life of the tribe. On the morning of their departure, Kale came to Emily as she stood by Julian's grave. "He was a good man," Kyle said, standing beside her. "He taught you well." Emily simply nodded her throat tight. "My path is with my people," he continued softly, "and yours is here. This is your home." The words were a gentle goodbye, an acknowledgement of an impossible reality. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't realize had fallen. "But a path can be revisited," he added, a promise shining in his dark eyes. "The memory of the brave woman at the creek will not be forgotten." He then turned and walked away, mounting his pony to join his father at the head of the column. Emily watched them go, a long line of warriors fading into the horizon until the prairie was once again silent and empty. The silence, however, was different now. It was not the silence of loneliness, but of peace. She had faced down death war and prejudice, and she was still standing. Her home was safe. She was no longer just the widow of Julian Vance. She was Emily of the open prairie, the woman who shared her water, a friend to the Lakota. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that one day she would look to the horizon and see a lone rider approaching not as an enemy, but as a friend returning to a path he had promised he wouldn't forget. If this story of courage, sacrifice, and a love that defied all boundaries resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories like this. Share this video with a friend who appreciates tales of the Old West and the untamed human heart. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications. We have so many more stories to tell, from the dusty plains to the rugged mountains, and we wouldn't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening and for joining us on this journey.